So those of you who can see the screen share. Can we see it? So can we see the screen share on here?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So on here is Elder Seaman got asked a question, and he was asking so many questions that I thought that using this would be a pretty good basis for one of these videos. We've covered some of this material in the past, and so some of it will be more of a review, but generally speaking, I just kind of want to address some of the ways in which you are able to deal with some of these often brought up and raised issues without kind of going down into a deep rabbit hole. It's one of the problems that we often have as missionaries, is that we tend to kind of rabbit hole ourselves, in the sense that we start focusing on trying to prove or disprove the claims and arguments that other people are making. So those of you who've watched past videos can remember that we try, rather than to focus on fact specifics, we want to try to focus on the general argument that's being raised and not so much with the specific details. Now that sounds like a cop-out to some degree. I think some people would say, hey, you're copping out. But the reason that we go with that approach is because obviously you can sit and go deep into this stuff, and you can go deep into this stuff ad nauseum forever. And the problem with a lot of these things, so like looking at the first one here, obviously we're going to talk about the translation process of the Book of Abraham. So what you've got here is you've got some issues that were raised by somebody, and then these are the questions that Elder Seaman raised. And I think that they're pretty good questions. And so we're going to go through and try to address as many of them as possible. But keep in mind, the scholarship that underlies a lot of these claims is deep. Entire books have been written on a lot of these subjects. And so with respect to the fact that entire volumes of books exist and documents exist and scholarly articles exist, BYU, the RSC has quite the volume of articles that can address a lot of the specifics. What we need to remember though is that don't ever assume a burden of proof. The onus or the burden is always on the person making a claim. So for example, in this first claim, it says the translation process of the Book of Abraham is false. Now, while that's obviously, I guess, some allusion to the manner in which Joseph Smith claims that the Book of Abraham was translated, it's an incredibly poorly worded statement that really is nonsensical. The translation process of the Book of Abraham is false. I don't know what that means. So the very first thing I would do with a statement like this is say, what does this mean? I don't get it. I don't understand what the translation process of the Book of Abraham is false means. Now, are you saying that it is false that Joseph Smith actually translated the Book of Abraham? Well, I guess that's what he's asking. So let's proceed from that assumption, because obviously the fact that it was translated in and of itself, as this claim reads, can't be false, because as we well know, if you look into church history, Joseph Smith, and we know this from the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon translation process is generally understood as being by the gift and power of God. That's the process by which Joseph Smith claims to have translated the Book of Mormon. Now, in connection with that claim that he claims to have done it through the gift and power of God, there are other accounts from Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and even Emma Smith and others as to how specifically that process was undertaken. Now, it is from the varied accounts, which again, there's entire volumes of articles and books on these subjects. There's a great book called The Witnesses that's often recommended by Daniel Peterson that talks about the three witnesses. It talks about some of the translation processes as they're recorded in the journals of Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery. So going into that, and that's one of the things you always have to remember, is that a lot of these claims are intended to overwhelm. It's why the CES letter is such an effective tool to kind of drive people away from the church, because it touches on so many issues in a shotgun approach type of way, where it just surface level touches on them that people get overwhelmed. And they're like, there's so many things and there's so much stuff, and all of this can't be false, which of course the CES letter, the content isn't all false. That's not really the claim. The claim is really that Jeremy Runnels, the author of the CES letter, or actually I don't know what you'd call him, the editor, the compiler of that that list of malarkey. It's not that it's false. It's just that it's so many haphazard and poorly contrived misrepresentations of potential historical issues or factual issues that are very poorly researched. It's not scholarly. A scholarly article usually tries to develop an objective appeal by weighing both sides of a question. So they present a question and then they say, some people would argue this, and some people would argue that. And that's kind of the scholarly way in which you would present it. So for example, I'm reading a book right now that's called A House Full of Females. And it's I've really been enjoying it so far. And in the process of reading it, the author, it's very difficult to actually tell where she falls on the issue, because it's a book about early Mormon polygamy. And it's really difficult to figure out where she falls as far as her position as to whether or not Joseph Smith's claims of prophetic revelation and whether or not polygamy was a valid revelation from God, because she's so objective in the way that she just presents information. So she will say something like, Wilford Woodruff's journal records this, and Wilford believed, and he accepted, and Lorenzo Snow believed, and Brigham Young was doing this. But then she'll also say, local newspapers were reporting this, and so, who's an anti-Mormon source, or a source that's in opposition, she doesn't call him anti-Mormon, but a source that would oppose Joseph Smith's claim to be a prophet, states this. And then she kind of says, and the evidence for either of those claims is predicate largely on the determination of the individual as to which slant they want to place on it. So that is an objective representation of material. Obviously, if Joseph Smith was not a prophet, then you have to assess what he was, and you have to decide that for yourself. Could he have been a fraud? Could he have been a whatever? I mean, sure, I guess, but what you have to also do is you have to establish the basis for why you believe that. For example, what's his motivations? What's he attempting to achieve? And then down the rabbit hole you go, because now you're going to have to read all of Joseph Smith's writings, all of the statements from those who knew him, and you're going to have to reconcile the general positive opinions that people had about Joseph Smith, and that people didn't believe that he was a deceiver, that he was a fraud, that he was trying to deprive them of financial gain, or that he was mad for some kind of power, because that's not what people believed who knew him. And so if you want to make those claims, you'd have to find support for it. And that's why these claims are always made, because historical claims require so much depth to really get to the bottom of them. And so these kind of short and fast, and I guess almost stupid statements of the translation process of the Book of Abraham is false, it's just absurd. It lacks any kind of dimension. It's a one-dimensional accusation. Well, then he goes in and he says, Joseph Smith lied that the papyri were written by Abraham's hand and that the other papyri were written by Joseph of Egypt. So then it says this, Egyptologists are unanimous. Those papyri are the Book of Breathings, Book of the Dead, from the Coptic era, 200 CE, which is 1600 years after Abraham. So the problem with this particularly is these two statements are actually making about 5 different claims. And they're jamming them together as though these 5 claims are 2 points supporting the original premise. So one of the things that you guys need to always remember is that as you address specific issues when you're discussing some of these problems, which they're going to come up. Obviously, as you teach your investigators, they're going to hit their computers and they're going to search Google. These are some of the more common, I guess, the go-to arguments of most members. Now, if you'll notice, we've got Errol Amy here with us, so I'm going to ask him for some input in here and just kind of get his opinion. Errol's got some valuable insight. He's done some very deep research into some specific areas in Christian and church history. And by church, I'm not talking the Latter-day Saint church, but Christianity generally. So he's done some pretty deep searching in through the development of early Christian theology during and after the first century, but also too, Errol's a convert and a relatively, what I would consider a relatively recent convert. And so it's taken him a long time to come to the conclusion that the Latter-day Saint faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a restored version of Christ's original gospel. And so in looking at his perspective, we can talk to Errol and get his insight specifically into how he approached some of these issues and also how exactly he felt about them when he heard about them and how he was able to reconcile or deal with them. So first of all, I just kind of wanted to touch on the fact that, so 1A, Joseph lied that the papyri were written by Abraham's hand and that the other papyri were written by Joseph of Egypt. This is actually real simple. I mean, it's complicated, but you can answer it relatively simplistically. The beginning of the book of Abraham is claimed not to have been written by Joseph Smith. It's claimed to have been written by Abraham. So what happens is that this is written on papyri by Abraham's hand. And that is a claim that the author of the text is making about the text. It is not a claim Joseph Smith is making about the text. And that's very important because what's going on is that the author is, so, I mean, if I wrote a letter to somebody and I started off with something like that, this letter is from Travis and it is written in Travis's hand. And then I continued on my narrative. If that document was copied in its entirety, the entire document would have to be copied. And that would mean that any subsequent person who copied the text would be copying down that I wrote that text. But that claim made by the author who is copying it, or the scribe, is actually a false claim because the copyist is not the original author. Does everybody get that? Anybody have any questions about that? Make sense? Okay. So in looking at that, if you guys have a question, just chime in. You're welcome to say, hey, I got a question. So in looking at that, you've got to recognize that the claims in the text, and so it's important as you study your scriptures that you recognize, for example, at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, you have that original, I think it's the title page or the introduction, whatever it's called, the title page, that is written by Mormon. So Mormon is claiming, I am the editor, I am the person who compiled these records. And that's his actual hand. That is not something that Joseph Smith wrote about it. Now, there's an introduction to the Book of Mormon, which kind of explains that this is a record of a people who left Jerusalem and blah, blah, blah. And that is an appended addition by the church to explain what the text is. That's not a claim that the Book of Mormon is making about itself. But at the very beginning, that's where Mormon makes the apologies that, if there be weaknesses, condemn not the things of God, that whole claim. That is written by Mormon. Just like the preface to the Book of Abraham says, by the hand of Abraham on papyrus, that is a claim that's being made by Abraham, its original author. It's not being made by Joseph Smith. So this actual first statement is simply a misunderstanding of what the Book of Abraham is claiming about itself. But it actually reflects specifically to claim B, because if copyists are copying and copying and copying and copying and copying and copying and copying, if indeed that's the case, then the actual papyrus doesn't need to be 4,000 years old. The papyrus can be 2,000 years old, even though Abraham lived 4,000 years ago, because obviously a copyist copying and copying and copying can copy on recent papyrus the words of somebody living 2,000 years ago who is claiming that the content of the document was written in their own hand on papyrus. So it's actually kind of a bait and switch type of an argument that's being made here. It's a very superficial argument. It's very common. It actually doesn't get into the meat of the Book of Abraham, with the exception of it does talk about the fact that the papyri themselves, at least those that we have, are actually a book of breathings. Egyptologists have determined that this is a book of the dead or book of breathings. It's not actually called the Book of the Dead. I can't remember the actual name for what it's called, but Book of Breathings is what it's typically referred to as. It is a very common funerary text, and Latter-day Saint Egyptologists obviously disagree with the general consensus on this issue to varying degrees. And there's several arguments. There's several other arguments, and I just want to real quick. Errol, do you have anything that you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, sure. So we've got plenty of eyewitness accounts, including from people who weren't Latter-day Saints, who were hostile towards the church, in fact, that the original Joseph Smith papyrus were 4 long scrolls. And the fragments that we still have today make up a tiny portion of the original papyrus collection. And specifically, we are told that the outer portions of the papyrus were damaged because they were in rolls. So the outer portions would, reasonably have more wear and tear over, the centuries they existed. And so the brethren actually cut off the outer portion of the scrolls and mounted them in sheets to help to preserve them. Now, those are not the portions that Joseph Smith claimed to have translated from. Again, the record shows that the portions he translated from were said to have been in very good condition and had some other unique signature marks that we just don't see in the papyrus. So the papyrus that we have are mere fragments, and those contain the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings. But you can't just automatically use that to discount the entirety of the non-extant original papyrus collection that was lost in a fire.
Right. Hey, just real quick. Hey, Christopher. So Christopher Davis just logged on. I invited him to attend too. So everybody wave to Brother Davis.
Hello and good evening.
Thanks for joining us. Hey, so what we're doing is we're going through this laundry list, if you can see this, of some of these claims. It's not nearly as long as the CES letter, but some of the similar claims, basically just to kind of work through some of the arguments, to give the missionaries a general overview of a kind of a short and fast way to understand the complexity of the issues, in the sense that these issues are not something that anybody should take upon themselves to try to do some kind of a complete and total rebuttal. That's going to be impossible. but to at least give them the ammunition to understand that a lot of these claims are made because of their complexity. And that what a lot of the claims that are made by those who are attacking the church are trying to do is they're trying to do laundry lists, like the Jeremy Runnels CS letter, where they're just trying to shotgun approach, throw a bunch of hard and dirty, what they call facts at people. And so we're just kind of discussing how these aren't facts. So if you want to look at these, Christopher, and just see the first kind of there, if you have anything you want to add about the Book of Abraham, its translation process, anything you've got?
Am I on mute, or can you hear me?
We can hear
Okay.
you. I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just zooming in because my eyes, they are not as good as they used to be. And hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Errol. I thought you were doing a great job.
Errol, were you,
yeah.
real quick, Chris, were you done, Errol?
No, I could just briefly reiterate what you said about the first point, but I think you were
Yeah.
pretty
Just
much-
let Errol finish then.
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, like Travis said, the first portion, it's just referring to the text, the original manuscript. I mean, if Moses had said somewhere in the Bible, like, I wrote this with my own hand in Hebrew, and then thousands of years later, a modern English translator translated that verbatim, but into English, wrote that with my own hand on this document. And would anyone be shocked, surprised, would their faith be shaken if they found out that the manuscript that scholar translated from was dated to the medieval period? No one's going to bat an eye. I mean, of course it was. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. So the text itself, as translated, is just what the original author was saying about what was in front of them. It's not what we have in front of us.
Right.
Short and sweet. I mean,
Cool. Christopher, did you have anything?
No, I think that's right. I mean, if you had a manuscript of the Bible that was written in first person, you wouldn't go ahead and assume that this manuscript was handwritten itself. You wouldn't have any problem accepting the fact that you're dealing with a copied manuscript. And in the same sense, we have that same parallel here, where you're reading something that has been copied, and in some cases, some arguments would say even repurposed by using some associated texts or texts that can be repurposed or reintegrated or whatnot into a Jewish context, and they may be Egyptian in origin. It still doesn't mean that that person wrote that actual piece of paper. It's a copy. And so, in the same sense, if a codex from 200 years before Christ was a copied manuscript from something 100 years earlier, that person wouldn't be accused of saying, well, that's false, because obviously Ezra didn't write this thing and he's talking in the first person. That's really how trivial this claim is.
Right. And elders, it really takes a lot of just you've got to think it through. A lot of these issues don't require a lot of scholastic, deep learning. They require some common sense. Obviously, we all know that any evangelical or other Christian knows the original autographs of the Greek New Testament have been lost to time. All we have is later manuscripts. We're fortunate that there are some manuscripts that kind of date to maybe the early 2nd century. So you're talking after 100 AD. And so those manuscripts just kind of reflect, and they kind of reflect an early authorship is all you really get from that. And most of those earlier copies are very small. They're incomplete. They're fragmentary copies. And when they talk about copy of the New Testament, they're not talking about an entire copy of the New Testament. In some, there's a P52, I think, is a small fragment of the John manuscript. It's the size of a credit card. And that's considered a manuscript copy of the Greek New Testament. Now, where does that manuscript date? Well, it takes two major fields. One of them is actually studying the document itself, the actual material on which it's written. So if you're writing on papyrus, papyrus actually has genetic material in it because it's a plant-based material and it was living. If it's written on something like vellum, or you're talking about a sheepskin or something, there's actual DNA in it. There's cellular structure. So there are people who will study the material on which the document is read. And that's where they're talking about with the Book of Abraham, about the document not dating correctly. Is they're actually looking at what we have located from the Book of Breathings and said, hey, these actual papyrus is not that old. It's not old enough to be Abraham. So there's that part of it. And then there's another field of study called paleography. And that's where they actually study ancient writing styles. And so a joke that I often use, and Christopher, Errol and I are going to know this better, but if you say, hey dude dates you to a certain period of time. And it's not as common that people say, hey dude, now, but it's common, you've heard it, but back when we were kids, hey dude meant something different. Things were cool. You guys are now using terms, and there's one that I see commonly posted in the cavalry that's like sus. I don't know what sus means. You'll notice that as Errol and I and Christopher speak, we don't use like as often as some of the younger people do, because we weren't raised in eras where people spoke that way. And so you can actually look at a context in a text itself and see, based on the word usage, where it would date to by an approximation. So my mother, for example, writes in cursive. She always writes in cursive. She's 68 years old. So my 68-year-old mother, who always writes in cursive, was raised back during a time when cursive was taught in schools. So if you find a document written in cursive that's using certain languages, and I'm trying to think of something from like the 60s and 70s, for example, that would be a phrase common to those, some flower child type statement. But groovy, for example, if somebody's feeling with things are groovy, that's probably not from 2021. Written all in cursive, 2021, that person is either older or they were raised in an era where that was, or in a location. So paleography is a way in which we would adduce those kinds of conclusions. But again, none of that stuff is hard and fast. None of it's concrete. It's all just an educated, well-reasoned conclusion, but never a fact. It's not factual. The dating of a papyrus are approximation. The dating of a document using paleography is an approximation. And so a lot of times they will present things as a hard and fast, well, this is a fact, and this is a fact, and it's not a fact. It's an approximation, it's an assumption, it's a presupposition, and then of course you've got the individual person making the claim and their bias. Do you guys have anything you wanted to add, Christopher?
I'm just going to say one thing, and then I'll concede the rest of the time to you on Book of Abraham. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind, briefly, is to make sure we all understand that the church was very transparent about the Book of Abraham right out of the gate. We received the extant manuscripts, and we published what we found in I don't know if it was 68 or 69, the 1968, 1969 New Era, in which we were just up front saying, this is what this is. And we don't know how this Book of Breathings relates to the Book of Abraham. So a lot of what you're going to run into is some inference to say, you guys were pulling something for a long time, but now you can't, no, we've been up front since the very beginning of what we have. And that transparency has been there for a while. If people didn't know it, then it's because people didn't bother to look at it. But, we really don't have to spoon feed this stuff. The church up front said, we don't know what, if anything, this has to do with what we have right now has to do with the Book of Abraham. And I think that's important to make sure you're not feeling like there's something hidden or there's something we're ashamed of about this. That's just not the case.
And I think that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks, because that point is very much another argument that's raised in connection with many of these claims, is that the church was hiding, was misrepresenting, or trying to otherwise deceive its members, when really the sources of this material are the church. The church itself was presenting and producing this material. When manuscript found, the Solomon Spalding manuscript was located, the church published it in their newspaper. There wasn't any attempt to try to hide any of these documents as they were located. Ethan Smith's documents and those kinds of documents that were, purported sources for the Book of Mormon, the church has been very upfront about producing them themselves, and they do that in order to show that they're transparent. It's one of the reasons that I've always had a hard time kind of tongue-in-cheek taking many of these arguments, particularly when they allege that there's been deception. Now, I want to move on real quick, that we got quite a few of these, so I want to go relatively quickly. This one's really short. This is the Fanny Alger claim. Joseph had sex with Fanny Alger at age 14. So Fanny Alger was married, well, and that's the problem. So the first principle of polygamy, plural marriage, whatever you want to call it, is the church's term for it, generally speaking, was plural marriage, not polygamy. Polygamy or polygyny had a specific historical context, and it meant, it was actually in the 19th century, it was more common referred to as bigamy. And that's where somebody had a wife in Chicago and they also had a wife in New York. Anybody who's familiar with early 20th century gangsters like Al Capone and people like that, they were often bigamists. They would have a wife in New York and a wife in Chicago and a wife in whatever other town that they were in, and they would bounce between these different households. That's bigamy or polygamy. Now, the issue with it is the church called it plural marriage because it focused more on the spiritual aspect of sealing. And it's important to recognize that Fanny Alger specifically was married to Joseph Smith, or sealed to Joseph Smith, and it was a sealing. There is no evidence of any kind of sexual relationship that I'm aware of. And I've read a lot of Brian Hale's books, and I've read a lot of primary material from these sources about Fanny Alger. She never alleges that she had a sexual relationship with the prophet, and there isn't any evidence. So the first claim that's usually made about this particular thing is that Joseph Smith was engaged in pedophilia. In the 19th century, a marriage to a girl at 14 would have been unusual. Less than probably about 15% of women who were married were in these age categories when they were first married. So it wouldn't have been a common occurrence. It's not like people were hitching up their children to each other at 15, 14, 16 years old. Common marrying ages were in the early 20s, 20, 21, 22 for women, a little bit older for men. Very common, very, very much like it is today. Of course, now the age for first marriage for many men is getting closer to 30. And for many women, it's up in the mid 20s and close to 30 as well. There's not a whole lot of difference there. Never really has been much difference between men and women. But back then, 14 would have been seen as young, but certainly not unseemly. Edgar Allan Poe, for example, married his 13-year-old cousin when he was 28. So the idea of a man marrying a young girl would not have labeled him as a pedophile. And so that's an improper use of that term, and not something that I would have accepted. But again, there's just simply no evidence for a sexual relationship between him and Fanny. It was a sealing after the prophet was killed, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years after this sealing took place. I think this took place in 43, 42 is when I think this sealing took place. So within about 2 years, the prophet was dead. She remarried and actually remained faithful with the Latter-day Saints, and was an advocate of polygamy. Again, there's a great book on that. It's called A House Full of Women. It's a really good book. Kind of talks about early Mormon polygamy. and it talks about some of the objective benefits that women found from the polygamy. And it's a surprising book. It's not something that you'd have expected. So do Errol, Christopher, do either of you have anything you want to add?
Errol, you got anything?
I mean, there is nothing. There's,
Yeah.
there's,
I
I'm
probably
I'm
probably
just
said 3 times more than you needed to.
I'm just gonna add a little bit of to this. One of the benefits of doing family history is you get to know your family very well. And I can truly say that I have 4 ancestors in the colonial / Revolutionary War period up until the time of Joseph Smith that were all teenage brides. One of them as young as 14. I know it's not common, but none of them were LDS. So you do get a little bit of perspective when you kind of look in the past and see, how the frontier days things operated. I just can't pass judgment on an era that, quite frankly, is as alien to me as living in India. It just doesn't work that way. And also, I think this argument kind of comes from a perfect storm of about maybe 3 or 4 different things that are basically trying to be stirred around into one argument. What's your problem? Is your problem polygamy? Okay. Is your problem young versus old? Is your problem this ceiling issue between multiple people? And what this tries to do is create a mixed bag of problems and creates kind of a tangled mess. So you really need to kind of extricate, when faced with this, what is your concern here? Is your problem with polygamy? Fine, let's talk about polygamy. Is your problem with young brides? Is your problem with, is it a marriage or is it a ceiling? Let's deconstruct this argument so that it's not such a hot mess for you to deal with. Anybody that has a problem with, I joke around. I grew up in theater. My mother worked for the church in theater, so I can almost memorize the entire play of Fiddler on the Roof, and that's the entire premise of that play. Is Tevye is trying to marry off 5 of his teenage daughters to men, so that and that's the tradition, and the entire play is about this the tradition of stability and this the continuation of these traditions, the family unit, versus this new burgeoning love, and everything is driven by love, and how Tevye tries to reconcile the 2 things. His daughter Zeidel is supposed to marry the butcher Laser Wolf, who is older than Tevye. That's and people are accepting this play as, oh, okay, well, that's the traditional way of doing things, but we understand this is the turn of the century. This is all about romance and love and how this enters the perspective here. So I think there's a big disconnect here, and it's played upon either intentionally or unintentionally to try and make you, not really understand the things in play from a different bygone era. So to me, this is a big nothing burger.
Yeah, and I would agree. And elders, what Christopher has just explained is called presentism. That's when you impose your own social mores and norms on the past. When you do that, you are doing so unfairly and accusatorily by saying, well, you should have been as evolved and civilized and cultured as I am now. Very common and very destructive perspective. And some of what we call revisionist history that's going on in our education system is actually a product of that. People are trying to take more modern concepts like racism, for example, and they're imposing them on 19th, 18th, 17th century people, when really those people didn't really view people based on necessarily what was perceived as skin color, for example, but they saw their culture as alien. They saw their culture as less evolved, less developed. And in those paradigms in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, what people saw is they felt like, well, the problem with those peoples are not necessarily their skin color, but they are without God. And so there's a lot of this idea of converting the natives. And while that may sound like it has some very good benefits, and certainly arguments could be made one way or the other, the reality of it is we often impose a racial, racism, racist, racial kind of paradigm on people, just as we do with concepts like somebody who's attracted to younger women is a pedophile. Well, a man in 1811 marrying his 13-year-old second cousin when he's 31 would have been not common, but would not have been something that would have made the national news. And so people were a little bit more accepting of things that we today would be considered odd. As long as you got married in a church by a preacher, everything was kosher. Those were the things that they were more concerned about, not necessarily the age of the bride and the groom. So this next one is actually just a debacle of allegations. Joseph Smith instituted polygamy to have sex, to justify sexual relations that were otherwise illicit. He stole women from men, stole their wives, stole their daughters. He hid extramarital affairs from Emma for 8 years and then concocted the story of the commanding angel. Got a couple little points on that. And then the Orson Hyde specifically. This Orson Hyde story is actually batted around. It actually appears in a meme. And I've actually got the meme. I'm going to share it with you right now. Because everybody see this? Okay, can you guys see this? Okay, so somebody posted this. This is a meme about the Orson Pratt. And the reason I brought this up is it just shows how simple some of these issues can be resolved. In this claim is that basically Orson Hyde was sent on a mission so that Joseph could steal his wife. And that's effectively what was happening. So here is the actual story. It says Miranda Hyde was sealed, not married to Joseph, over a year after Orson left. Other accounts have this occurring after his return. So right there, there's actually a problem in the historical records as to when exactly it occurred. Was Joseph sealed to Orson Hyde's wife, not married? Again, they use that as an interchange. So anytime anybody brings up polygamy, make sure you are careful with the claim that married or sealed. They will use them interchangeably, but they are distinct and different. Being legally married or in a marital relationship with a woman would have allowed for a sexual relationship. But being sealed to somebody alone would not necessarily permit a sexual relationship. Joseph Smith and others were sealed to children, small children. They were sealed to other men. So would those have permitted them to engage in a sexual relationship? Of course not. So remember, anytime somebody is playing fast and loose with their terminology, they're trying to misrepresent something. So Joseph Smith was sealed to Miranda Hyde. He was not married to her. If it occurred after Orson left, it said she became pregnant with Orson Washington Hyde after Orson returned from his mission to the Holy Land. Orson remained married to Miranda until 1870, being sealed to her himself after Joseph's death. So effectively, Miranda was sealed to Joseph, and then within a short period of time, either before or after Orson returned, and then Orson continued and remained her lawful husband. And they actually conceived and bore a child together. And that happened a long time after he had returned, so it was not Joseph's child. Some people have claimed that. The historical records don't line up that way. And then so what happened is she bore 2 additional sons with Orson. Here, in order to be somewhat honest, I distinguish the fact Joseph was sealed spiritually to women who remained married temporally to their living husbands. And he did so in the overwhelming majority. I'm talking there's like 2 exceptions with the husband's consent. in all cases with their knowledge. The husband might not have liked it, but in all cases with their consent. Joseph Smith, for example, had a friend who was not a member of the church and loved the prophet, just didn't have any interest in joining with the church. His wife was a member, and he actually recommended that his wife be sealed to a man as good as Joseph. So some of these claims are simply playing fast and loose with what are deep historical events that require some depth. So don't let people make these claims. And how do you get around it? So real quick, guys, anytime somebody makes a claim, make them produce all of the documentary evidence to support it. Make them do the homework. Don't go and disprove it. All they're doing is making a claim. Don't waste a missionary's time sitting there trying to rebut and search and dig and use the time you could be using studying the scriptures or studying your lessons, improving your teaching, studying something like, did Orson Hyde, did Joseph Smith steal Orson Hyde's wife? It's a complicated issue, and it requires some knowledge and it requires some resources, may or may not have. So always, whenever they make an issue like that, always try to require that the person making the claim supply the evidence in support of it. Errol, Christopher, do either of you have something you wanted to say?
I'm good.
Okay,
I think
good.
we've covered it.
Okay. Okay, anachronisms. Do either of you have something to say about anachronisms? That's a weak point for me.
Powerful evidence in favor of the Book of Mormon. As the years have rolled on, I mean, what was it? Alexander Campbell, who came up with the initial list of supposed anachronisms in the Book of Mormon for flora and fauna and metallurgy and all that stuff. The more and more that archaeologists have discovered, the shorter and shorter that list has progressively become, as we found that, like particularly in Mesoamerica, lo and behold, turns out that those things actually do exist. Bees, dogs, pigs. I mean, all this stuff, pre-Columbian, already existed in Book of Mormon areas and Book of Mormon times. And yeah, that list will probably continue to become smaller as the decades roll by and archaeologists discover more.
Well, and I think that's a great point, Errol, and I'm glad you brought that up. Personally, I think that a lot of people make fun of loan shifting. I don't. I think it's a very real part of the historical record. The discoverers of the New World engaged.
Hey, Christopher, you'll want to tell them what that term means.
Loan shifting is when a word is used that we wouldn't necessarily call it now, but at the time when they looked at something, they said, okay, that looks like this, so let's call it that, even though we know it isn't. For example, the Greek word hippopotamus literally means water horse. I mean, technically, it's a loan shifted word. It's borrowing horse and using it in its description. So when I know without a shadow of a doubt that Joseph Smith knew what a horse was. I know without a shadow of doubt, well, probably not a shadow of doubt, I'm pretty sure that Isaiah knew what a horse was. I have no idea what Mormon, the prophet in 400 AD, considered a horse. And we don't have any reason why they would have some sort of link to one another to do that. So whatever Mormon called a horse, was probably something horse-like, is something that he was being described. We don't have any record in the Book of Mormon anywhere of a horse ever being ridden. There are a couple of instances where horse is used when Isaiah is quoted. The rest of the time, horse is used in one or two ways. It's either used in provisions, or it's being associated with a chariot, which is another word that can be borrowed. So we really don't know what Mormon's talking about. And I'm fine with that. I mean, we really don't have to invent answers in order to say this is true, so long as we have an answer for every question. Maybe there was a horse. Maybe there was a pony. Maybe there was some sort of animal, and there can be an archaeological answer for that. There have been some teeth dug up. I could find the report for it. There have been some teeth dug up down in Central America to say maybe this was a horse. And there's some arguments against that to say, okay, maybe they were some teeth from a horse, but it's from a later period and we have some contamination by animals. I don't really care because at the end of the day, what Mormon called a horse could be something that I might say, hey, that's not a horse. But, I don't care because we didn't really feel that there was a need to devote a section, an appendix to the Book of Mormon for zoological questions. We just moved on.
Well, and what's really interesting is that if you look at the concept of ancient, let's take ancient cave drawings. Oftentimes we look at the cave drawings and most of them today, we would view them as a stick figure. And so we see people with some kind of arched looking weapon and another kind of a stick weapon. Well, because we're familiar with a bow and arrow, we assume that thing being depicted in that stick figure drawing is a bow and arrow, but it could have been something else. It could have been something completely different. We see something that has a long body, 4 legs, a longer neck, and a head. And we're like, oh, that must have been their horses. They may not have had horses. That could be some other completely different domesticated animal or non-domesticated animal that they were fond of and that they drew. So the same holds true for somebody like Mormon, as Christopher was saying. Somebody could have said, hey, this is what a horse looked like, and they drew some rudimentary something, and then there weren't that exact animal in the locality. So the people would have said, oh, horse, and then just found an animal that kind of resembled that picture. So you have to remember that the claims of the Book of Mormon, if they're not like that, then what happens is that you're imposing on the text claims it's not making for itself. And you've got to be really careful with that. Now, generally speaking, with a lot of these anachronism issues, you've got to recognize that as the evidence, as Errol said, that as the evidence comes forward for those, none of it is specific. A lot of people who make claims about archaeological claims, for example, evangelicals often argue that there's a lot of evidence for what happened in the Bible. But when you say, did Jesus walk on water? Because we know where Jerusalem is. They learn that they need to disconnect those two claims from each other. Just because we can identify Jerusalem and Egypt and Rome does not mean, and that we can find Nazareth, and we know where Tarsus is. So because we know where those things were, does not mean that Paul saw a light and heard a voice. It does not mean that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Those are different claims and cannot be supported by any archaeology. And the fact that archaeology exists that can support some of the cities mentioned, the only thing that proves is that the author, 1, identified a known city, and 2, that city is still known today. And that's the big problem with archaeology. Until we locate a city and also locate some evidence that the name of the city is what the archaeologist accepted that it was, you're guessing. And just because you're like, well, we expected Sodom and Gomorrah to be in this general location, and we found some cities there, unless you find a sign that says, this is Sodom, you can't know that it's Sodom. And even if you find that sign, you don't know that the original city was leveled and another city was built on it, and it's another Sodom that's completely different than the one that's mentioned in the Bible. So there's a lot of presuppositions that go into this whole archaeology proves the Bible. Christopher, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to, I want to give hat tip to Neil Rapley. Here's an excellent example of loan shifting. In 1770, the settlers for the English settlers for Australia came down to Australia, and they met the Aborigines down there, and it's written they're all armed with darts and wooden swords. So that's in the official record in 1770. Well, what they meant by wooden sword, we would call a boomerang now. So if we were to go back and say, well, that's how is that record? That's got to be a false record. You can't call it a wooden sword. That's how loan shifting works. They're using words that they're seeing something odd. They don't know how to explain it. You're using a word that they are familiar with, and basically saying, and it functions as a sword. It really does. But it's more of a throwing weapon. So it's like a throwing sword. So, this is how loan shifting works. And it's actually more common than a lot of people realize it does. I understand the anti-argument. And I think it comes from a place where they're just not thinking, they're really not thinking critically about the nuance of language and how fluid it can be. And I'm trying to be very patient with them while they're doing this, because to some people it is, oh wow, it can be an oh wow moment. And I think that can be a place for you to be a little bit charitable with them, because even from our standpoint as members of the church, we could look at that and say, that seems strange, that seems off. Maybe maybe this isn't what I think it is. And we would want ourselves to be patient with that as well. So, a little help in helping our critics see how language works, understand that loan shifting is just a common occurrence of language. When two cultures meet and they're trying to decipher the similarities and the differences between them, they're going to borrow from what they know.